By watching this video, you're going to learn what a magic method is and how to implement two magic methods, the constructor and toString. I'm going to start by posing a question. What if you need an additional room to your house? What do you do? Well, unless you're a really good do-it-yourselfer, you probably would hire a contractor and discuss with the contractor what the room should look like, what the specifications are, what it needs to do, everything, and then pay the contractor to construct that room. In computer science, we have the same concept. PHP calls these magic methods. In my opinion, this is not a very helpful term. I prefer to use the term from Java and C++. They're actually called contracts. And magic methods, or contracts, as we call them in Java, are as follows. And I do have a link to this page on the page that accompanies this screencast. But essentially, contracts pretty much have two parts. Just like real-life contracts, we have a requirement upon the caller made by the class and a promise made by the contractor. So, in other words, here we have kind of a computer science-like economy where you need the PHP interpreter to do something special for you, and you're willing to pay the PHP interpreter to do that for you. And your currency here is your code. You write special code for this contract to be executed. Now, by writing that code, the PHP interpreter in return will give you a special feature or do something automatically for you and make your life a lot easier. So, that's what we mean by a contract. And again, PHP calls these magic methods, but it's essentially the same idea. So the first contract we're going to enter into is called the constructor. The constructor is basically, let's take our profile class that we wrote in the last screencast and extend it. The constructor is essentially, we could have manually run all these little set profile ID, set user ID, set first name, set last name. We can do that in order to fill in an object, and that would work. But given that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 fields here, we'd have to run the set methods 4 times. And most typically what we're doing is we're creating a new object from MySQL. So MySQL has gift wrapped the profile ID, the user ID, the first name, and the last name. We already know what it is, and we'd have to call 4 methods in order to do that. Now the constructor says, wait, we can streamline that and we can make your life easier by putting it into one line of code. And the constructor also has another special feature to it. Is the constructor is what is run when the object is created. This is a process known as instantiation. Essentially, what instantiation is a two-step process. Number one, PHP will create a block of memory that will accommodate the object. And then number two, it'll run the constructor in order to fill in the object with what you need. Now, the first part is always given. PHP will always give you enough memory to work with. The second part, you have to enter into a contract in order for PHP to do it for you. If you don't do that, it's okay. PHP will just leave the memory alone and just give you blank memory with nothing in it. However, if you do enter into the contract like we're about to, we're gonna be able to streamline the filling in of the blanks and not have a blank piece of memory. We'll have useful memory. So let's get to coding this. Now, in order to enter into this contract, we have to implement a special method. But like any other method, I will make no exceptions to this rule, we need a doc block. So we're going to start off with our constructor doc block. Now, constructors typically for a object like this with 4 fields in it will need 4 parameters, 1 for each field. Who am I to argue with convention here? So since we have 4 parameters, I'm going to put in 4 @parent tags in the doc block like we saw in the last screencast. I'll do this real fast. And please note that the order in which I'm putting these is the order in which they are listed here in the main area of the state variables. This is not by mistake. This really creates the real consistent look and feel to your code and a consistent use, and makes it easier for developers to work with your code. It's very important that you do that. Okay, almost there. We can throw an exception here, so I'm going to put that in. All right, our doc block is ready. This is going to be a pretty typical poster child doc block for a constructor. You'll have 4 parameters here, given that you have 4 state variables. If you had 5 state variables, you'd have 5 parameters, etc. And you might throw an exception or 2 along the way. Now, we're going to implement the construct method. Now, all the magic methods in PHP start with 2 underbars. That's underbar, underbar. The constructor is actually called construct. But the important thing is that it must start with underbar, underbar. If it does not start with underbar, underbar, this will not work. There's my empty construct now. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in the parameters like the doc block promises. I'm going to fulfill at least that. All right, we have our parameters up. Now, we're going to actually see a new block that is covered a little more fully in a previous screencast under exception handling, but I'll give it a real fast review, is what's known as a try-catch block. Now remember, the try block contains code that might throw an exception. The catch block is what happens when an exception happens. And remember, an exception is an exceptional case, some sort of error condition. Again, view the exception handling screencast if you need a review of this concept. I'm going to actually write my catch block right now. So what we're actually going to do, this is another Java technique, it's called rethrowing. We're actually going to take the exception that we had and throw it again. This is like playing hot potato. We don't want to handle this exception. It's not appropriate for the constructor to be handling exceptions. The exceptions should be handled later on. So we're just going to pass the buck. Now, in order to pass the buck, we're going to create a new exception. We're going to give it an error message. So far, so good. We're going to use this parameter for the error code. Actually, we don't really need to use it, so I just set it to 0 and ignore it. The reason why I put that parameter in is that I really am interested in the third parameter. And there's no way to tell PHP, here's the first parameter, here's the third parameter. I actually have to do the first, second, and third. A little workaround, but it works. So what this third parameter is, what the point of this parameter is saying, look, I experienced an exception, and this is what happened. It's actually called the cause. What caused this exception to happen in the first place? Well, it was this exception. And by doing this, every time you rethrow, you pretty much create a link in the chain. And indeed, some programmers will call it an exception chain, where exception 1 was the root cause, and then it was rethrown at exception 2, and then rethrown to exception 3, blah, blah, blah. So that's called a rethrow. TLDR, rethrow is just, I don't want to handle this exception right now. It's not appropriate for me to be deciding on how your errors are supposed to be handled. Let me just pass it along. Okay, now we're going to go to the try block. Now the try block, we're actually going to call our mutators. Now this is really cool because we went to all of that hard labor and we went to extraordinary lengths to create thoughtful mutators that enforced the fact that we're getting good data within our object. This is a fantastic thing. So why should we reinvent? That's another rule of computer science. Never reinvent if you can at all avoid it. And now we're seeing that practice in action in the sense that we are going to, instead of directly assigning these like a lot of examples on the web, be careful about that. A lot of the examples on the web will just directly assign within a constructor. I don't favor this. I favor actually using the mutators because we've populated our mutators with careful input sanitization, and this way we can centralize where the input sanitization code is and not have to recopy code all over the place. It makes for a mess. Now, anyway, bringing this back to topic, this actually fulfills the contract. PHP said, if you implement the construct method for you, I'll go ahead and fill in the blanks on your profile class. And indeed, notice how we have 4 fields and we're calling 4 mutators. So the first thing it'll do is set the profile ID to new profile ID, set the user ID to the user ID, set the first name to the new first name, and set the last name to the new last name. And if any exceptions happen, they'll be rethrown back. So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here. I'm going to just kind of call it profile tac test.php. Just a little test file. Put my PHP tags up. Now the first thing I'm going to do is load the profile class by requiring it. So I'm going to require once profile.php. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the contract, use the constructor to create a new profile. Profile is assigned to new profile. And there we go. Now, to see this in action, what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to use the debugger here. And the setup of the debugger is going to be covered in another screencast. So please view that if you need help on setting up your debugger. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and start the debugging on the web page here. And then click right here to listen for debugging connections. And then finally, I'm going to set a breakpoint by, see where the line number is? Just to the right of the line number. You should get a little red little red circle right there. And also the line should be highlighted red. That's where I'm going to tell the debugger to stop and just breathe. All right, so I'm going to use the debugger to illustrate how the contract works. Now when I reload, I'm in the debugger. Now the debugger has stopped right here at the new profile line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step into this code. Now if you see real close here, we have these variables called new first name, new last name, new profile ID, new user ID. These are all the parameters that the constructor have and know about. And we can see the new first name is Homer, and the first name here is null. That means it hasn't been handled yet. It needs to be handled by what? Because by the mutator, and the mutator has not executed yet. Remember in the debugger, you're actually pausing the execution at the highlighted blue line. And so here we have not executed the set first name yet. And so that's why it's appearing as null. However, if I take a few steps, it will work. Just like that. I fast forwarded a couple of lines. Now I'm down at the end of the constructor. You can see the profile ID, the user ID, the first name have all been assigned. I encourage you to put this into the debugger yourself so you can play around with different parameters, see how it works, and also step into the mutators. That would also be educational, but I don't have time for it in this one video. So continuing on, if I step over set last name, then the constructor is complete. And if you notice, the profile now says profile ID is 1, user ID is 2, first name is Homer, last name is Simpson, just like we wanted. The object is now complete. And if we step out again, the next line that we're going to encounter is actually the end of the file. It's just the closing tag for PHP. It's not really worth much. And if we step out again, the debugger stops because the web page has successfully executed. We step through the debugger there to prove to you that the contract is working. By using the new keyword, the contract says, by using the new keyword, I will run your construct method. And indeed, we have used the contract successfully. Okay, I'm going to stop the debugger on both PHP Storm and the browser. And let's implement the next contract. So I'm going to echo the profile and reload the page and see what happens. We should get an error here. It shouldn't work. Oh, man, it didn't work. Wonder why. So we'll get this catchable fatal error, object of class profile could not be converted to string. Well, that brings up another contract for us in that PHP has a contract called toString, which will allow you to echo objects like this and print them out in any way you like and not have to manually run a method to do so. Again, PHP will give us the benefit of being able to echo something. But how do we pay for that? Well, we have to pay for that in code. So I'm going to go ahead and add that contract now. So I'm going to come to the end here. Now the magic method toString doesn't take in any parameters, doesn't throw exceptions, but it does return. It returns the string that you want to echo out whenever this is executed. So, to do that, what we're going to do is create a very simple method. Now again, all the magic methods, or contracts I suppose, in PHP start with 2 underbars. So that's underbar, underbar. 2 string. The toString method is actually renamed and stolen right from Java. So this properly is a contract. So all we need to do in here, it's really not much, is just create a string to echo out. And creating this string is actually really not that bad. All we really have to do is just create some HTML tags that incorporate everything about our class. So we'll start off with a p tag and say, this is my profile ID. This profile ID. And notice this is all one big line of code. It's all one big, huge line of code. It's demented, but when you have large lines of code like this, which will happen quite a bit, it's useful to actually break them up onto multiple physical lines, even though this is actually just one line. It makes it easier to read and easier to digest. Again, the idea of coding is not only to write good code, but to write good code that you can share with people and be a good team member. It's another good way to be a team member. And I also like to use the spacebar a bit to align my operators. It's a good practice to have. And now that I've printed out everything about my profile, I end the p tag. So what this essentially does, it's a little arduous, but it's really not that bad, is say, okay, profile ID is the profile ID. User ID is this user ID. First name is this first name, etc. And if we go back to the doc block and go back to the definition of the magic method, it tells us to return a string with an HTML formatted profile. Well, we've got our string ready. Let's go ahead and, without further ado, return it. And let's see how that looks. That error should go away now. And look at that. It did. Except I have one problem here. It didn't print out line by line like I wanted to. That's okay, easily fixed. All we need to do is add some BR tags to the end of these lines of code. Suppose I don't need that last one. And I want you to note that whatever you put in the toString method could be anything. Anything that you deem to be useful. And what's useful is whatever your application needs. There we go. That looks better. This is what the toString method gave me. Profile ID is 1, user ID is 2, first name is Homer, last name is Simpson. And it printed it out nicely in a nice little p tag for me. Now, back to what I was saying. You could, put this in a p tag. You could put it in a TR because you want it to be a table row. So you can, or you could put it as a bulleted list, an unbulleted list. You could use a multitude of ways to format this in HTML, or you could not format in HTML at all because maybe your application needs JSON. You can use JSON. Again, the toString method does invite flexibility and imagination. What do you need in your application? Anyway, that covers two magic methods or contracts in PHP, namely the constructor and the toString. There are more out there, and there's a link to the documentation that lists all the possible magic methods in PHP that you can implement. Implement them as you see fit. Again, like any other contract, financial, programming, or otherwise, consider your costs carefully. I'm going to be paying something in order to get this functionality. Is it worth it? In the case of the constructor, definitely. In the case of the other ones, you use your